Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and last of the semester installment of NCFS in Captivity book dialogue series. So as you probably know, I'm Masha Belenky, and we've co-organized this series with Rachel Mesch and Susan McCready. We're delighted to welcome you all today for a discussion of a new book by Elizabeth Emery in dialogue with Willa Silverman. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our two participants. Elizabeth Emery is professor of French at Montclair State University in New Jersey, where she teaches medieval and 19th century French literature and culture, directs the university's new faculty program, and serves as graduate program coordinator. She's the author of many books and articles and essay anthologies related to the reception of medieval art and architecture in 19th century France and America, including Romancing the Cathedral and Consuming the Past, the Medieval Revival in Fin de Siècle France. Her most recent works explore the links among early photography, journalism, and celebrity culture. She published two books related to these topics, Photojournalism and the Origin of the French Writer House Museum, and En toute intimité, quand la presse... I'm sorry, what is the title of... I must have mistyped something.
It's okay, just En toute intimité, it's fine.
En toute intimité. She currently serves as chair of the MLA 19th Century LLC Forum and is co-PI of a National Science Foundation grant for improving STEM literacy through engaged transdisciplinary learning. Her newest book, and the one she's going to discuss today, is Reframing Japonisme, Women and the Asian Art Market in 19th Century France, 1853-1914. This book was supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And Susan will post the link to where you can purchase the book along with a discount code. Elizabeth will be in conversation with Willa Silverman. Willa Silverman is Malvin and Lea Bank Professor of French and Jewish Studies at Penn State University and head of the Department of French and Francophone Studies. Her book publications include The New Bibliopolis, French Book Collectors and the Culture of Print, 1880-1914. This book was a winner of the MLA Scaglione Prize for French and Francophone Studies. And most recently, Henri Weber, Champion de l'Art Nouveau, published by Armand Collin, an edition of the jeweler's private notebooks from 1898. Recent articles include The Most Passionate of All, Henri Weber and Japonisme in Fin de Siècle France, published in the Journal of Japonisme, Aesthetic Languages of the Book in Fin de Siècle France, Japonisme, Symbolism, and Art Nouveau in the Private Library of Henri Weber, published in Quarendo, a journal devoted to manuscripts and printed books, and an essay on the chrononyme Fin de Siècle in Les Noms d'époque de Restauration à Année de Plomb, edited by the late Dominique Khalifa. In 2017, she was a visiting fellow in the history of 19th century art at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, where she led a series of seminars on art and life in Belle Époque Paris, collectors, decorative artists, and aesthetics. She's currently working on a monograph on Franco-American culinary exchanges from the mid-19th century through the early 20th century. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Elizabeth and Willa. Welcome, and we're so delighted to have both of you.
Thank you so much, Masha. And thank you to Rachel and Susan and Willa. So it really is, it's really an honor to be able to have my work included among all of these fantastic new publications. And it has been something of a leitmotif to talk about an NCF book but in this case, it really is an NCFS book. It developed out of a panel organized by Melanie Hawthorne for the 2012 Feast and Famine Conference, which Mike Garval organized in North Carolina. And so it's been nourished, if you'll allow me to say that, by many of you who are present today and who have really been incredibly kind and generous in providing tips and feedback and ideas. So to all of you, really, thank you, thank you, thank you. The project that was at that 2012 conference was about the Muse Identity. And when Melanie proposed an Asian takeaway as a title for the panel, it made me remember a secret museum that I had heard about as an undergraduate studying in France. The secret museum was supposed to have had free admission, which already was a strong point, but also to feature one of the largest collections of Japanese netsuke on display in the world. So here you have some netsuke. So all 2,000 of them were alleged to have been purchased in Paris by this eccentric woman whose husband bankrolled this folly or mania that she had, and he turned it into a shrine to her memory, preserving it exactly as she had decorated it. Now, this was the legend, and in 2012, I thought, everything I know about the history of collecting, about Japonisme as a field, this kind of exclusive field, made a really improbable story of the secret museum. I mean, how could you, first of all, accumulate one of the largest collections of netsuke on display in the world without leaving Paris? What was the likelihood that a 19th century husband would authorize such an expensive and over-the-top project, or that the Ministry of Fine Arts would even have accepted it or preserved it as the woman had wanted to have it kept? So this secret museum is, in fact, what we know today as the Musée d'Emery near the Bois de Boulogne, and its collection of small sculpted and ceramic objects really made it the perfect Asian takeaway for Melanie's panel, especially since it was reopening after 12 years of closure for renovation at that point. And what I can tell you is now that I've been working on this museum for over a decade, or for about a decade, all of my instincts were right. Pretty much anything that you read about this museum is either misleading or false. Most of the stories seem to have cropped up after Denery's death in 1898, and then just spread probably in order to improve the public image of French collectors at the beginning of the 20th century, when they're trying to create this new idea of discernment. I mean, if you look at this image, who is the collector here, right? An elderly, independent, and outspoken woman who spent her time writing, a woman writer, right? Or collecting and producing needlepoint tapestry, was not really someone they wanted to publicize as a collector. So in the book, I use the very appealing terminology used by Julie Johnson. So she talks about memory distortion and gaps to describe the process that has occurred at the Musée d'Emery, where an independently wealthy woman recognized publicly for her acumen in the 1860s, and who worked directly with the Ministry of Fine Arts to draw up her will and to organize a museum. She would then morph into this sort of strange, to hear some of the documents where she is actually writing and corresponding with the Ministry of Fine Arts. How could she morph into this sort of bizarre legends that we talk about today? Right? Even cultural institutions like Drouot, the Musée Guimet, and the Paris Tourist Board continually repeat things like, it's a miracle that this exists, or it's only due to her husband or to Georges Clemenceau. So we've talked a lot about scholarly affect in this book series so far, and I will embrace it. I have to say that these kinds of articles that are still in circulation today by people who should know better enrage me. And they enrage me because I've spent a lot of time now digging through materials, sometimes most of them undigitized, many of them uncategorized at the Musée Guimet, the Archives Nationales, Archives de Paris, Musée des Arts Décoratifs. And it's really quite frightening that the museum establishment continues to discuss the museum as women's work. It was a museum that was founded and organized at the same time with the same group of people as the Musée Cernouchy. And not only did Clémence Denery give the state her collection and the mansion in which she lived and which housed the collection, she also endowed it with a $500,000 franc investment that was intended to cover personnel costs and maintenance in perpetuity. So I don't know what they did with the money, but that was not her problem. When specialists claim that the museum was her husband's, it was not, or that the state would never have accepted the bequest without the help of powerful men, or that she was a famous actress or a cocotte. Actually, this one talks about her being a cocotte. It was not. Or that she started collecting in the 1880s, that her choice of objects was particularly feminine. She collected monsters, so not particularly feminine. So all of these things are untrue and have been built up through the years. During her lifetime, her contemporaries actually recognized the extreme value of her collection at the market value of the time. They praised it as men's work, and they compared it to the Muse Identity. They even devoted an article of la nature, to her collection. And so it's this disconnect between the gendered language that continues today to plague the museum and the adjectives and analogies used in the 19th century that have prompted many of the questions at the heart of what then became the book project. So what if memory of other women who collected Japanese and Chinese art, or objects even, anything, was similarly distorted or forgotten? Denry's visibility as a collector is quite unusual because she was financially and legally independent for some 40 years after her separation from her first husband. This gave her the tools and understanding to negotiate legal and cultural barriers in order to preserve this collection. But was her interest in valuable Japanese objects an anomaly for a woman, as I've been told by very many people? Was it simply that women weren't able to break free of the legal and social structures of the Code Civil as Denry did? So there are a lot of different questions, and one of them is what we think about in NCFS. We know about Madeleine Forestier in Bellamy. She helps these husbands. Was there a similar phenomenon going on in collecting circles? And if so, how do we then find these women? So that's sort of where the project emerged. And as you'll probably be able to tell from this discussion so far, or the description so far of the project, it's on a first level a fairly straightforward attempt to draw attention to many of the women, and some of them are named here on the list, who played influential roles in Japanese circles. So they come from a variety of different milieux, and they're engaged in all kinds of different activities. So I've really only begun to scratch the surface. This is not at all a comprehensive study. What I don't do in the book is I don't revisit Japanese tropes in literature, as many have done extremely well. Instead, I look at how women known to have collected, exhibited, written about, sold Japanese objects in the earlier part of the 19th century were pushed out of sight with the arrival of new and more scientific models. Right, we come back to this image, and how these very models excluded those without the legal or educational means to participate. And so while this is not a literary topic per se, it's very much about language's role in the construction of cultural legitimacy, right? And that's the big argument of the book. I pull out from works of Joan Scott, Griselda Pollock, Linda Nochlin, Jean Baudrillard, in thinking about the importance of narrative to justify and create both collections and canons. Jennifer Chris's doctoral thesis on women artists working in Japanese, Ejana Palienko's book on genius envy, and Christopher Reed's use of queer theory to rethink origin narratives and kind of the strategic jockeying among Japanese were all hugely influential. Many others as well, and especially perhaps Bourdieu's thinking about restricted fields of cultural production and consumption. And Japonisme, which was a field created in the second half of the 19th century, provides quite an interesting illustration of Bourdieu's points about circularity and reflexivity. If you look at the concept of Japonisme coined by Philippe Burti, he did this to privilege the findings of a small group of men who dubbed themselves as specialists and who pretty much inscribed themselves into a history that they were, in fact, writing. The specialist label was really a speech act if you think about the state of Japanese studies at this time. It was essentially formal training in Japanese art didn't occur in France until the 20th century. So claims to be specialists of Japanese art and particularly of prints, which the Japanese themselves did not consider art, provided a mechanism for these men to distinguish themselves from others, notably women, who also, all of them were collecting mixed Asian chinoiserie because they were collecting what was on the Paris market. And we can see so here in Burti's concern about rewriting Japonese to make it more institutionally palatable. He's concerned about people thinking it's a caprice de dilettante. So until the 1860s, when words like japonaiserie were coined to distinguish Japanese objects from Chinese, chinoiserie and Chinese often signified, they were sort of catch-all terms to talk about objects from the Far East, kind of like what we do for the term Asian today. So if the Goncourt brothers call Clémence Dennery's collection a Chinese museum in 1861, you have to read a little bit further because their description shows that this Chinese museum is made up of objects from Japan, India, China. And this is what many collectors of the time collected different objects, but then might call it a Japanese collection or a Chinese collection. Burti here may have defined Japanese as the study and appreciation of things Japanese, but by the late 1880s, when we see the mass market vogue for Japanese imports, it had become an increasingly restricted field. The small group of people who sold, traded, purchased, wrote about Japanese prints defined the field in their own image, and it's their desired version of Japanese that we continue to accept today. So if I call this book Reframing Japonisme, it's because I hope that if we take off this restrictive frame, which was constructed at a specific moment and for specific strategic purpose, it will help us see Japonisme as Burtis did initially, as a much more inclusive, multi-dimensional phenomenon, where we have men and women from a variety of backgrounds, studying, sharing, trading, talking about Japanese culture, often within family or social circles. And this is the picture that I see because I've been going through so many different kinds of archival sources and reading across them. What I see is what we can see between the lines in reading documents like Goncourt's journal or the diaries of collector Henri Wever, which Willa has so expertly edited. Wives, sisters, daughters, they're all kind of at the edges of the frame, right? They're in rooms. You can see them in pictures where they listen, they entertain, they examine works. They accompany family to art exhibits, or they receive gifts if they don't have the money to buy things for themselves. So each of my chapters introduces the stories of different women whose engagement with Japanese can help us understand how it operated in a much larger landscape than we currently discuss. So from its inclusive prehistory and the development of gendered categories that make us no longer see women's contributions, to the influential role of women art dealers in distributing these, in bringing them in, importing and exporting. So then to issues of travel, display, and institutionalization of imports as art rather than ethnography. So I hope that everybody will enjoy reading Reframing Japonisme and that it will bring new and more equitable understanding of the women, men, and Japanese nationals who've fallen into this kind of memory gaps, kind of stuck at the outside edges of this overly restricted frame. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you to the organizers, first of all, and congratulations, Elizabeth, on your wonderful book, which I, for one, certainly enjoyed reading. Your research is nothing short of amazing. You uncovered a trove of original, unpublished primary source material that really allows you to make the case very compellingly for what you call the persistent, unacknowledged influence of women in Japanese circles. And you analyze your sources very expertly. Your iconography is wonderful, and it's a fantastic book. I just want to say a word about how your work has made me go back and look at my own work on Henri Wever, and then we'll pick up on some of the points that you made in your speech. So in editing the diary of Henri Wever, who was known first and foremost as an Art Nouveau jeweler, but was also a kind of foremost Japonisant in that post-Goncourt generation that includes Gans and Gillot and Mijon and Bing and others, you've made me realize in a way that I drank the Kool-Aid by putting forward the narrative, interestingly, in a private diary that was never intended for publication, of a man who very much wanted to be what you indicated in the quote by Burti as one of these competent men, right? Who would indulge in legitimating practices to legitimate his status as a discriminating connoisseur. So these practices included, for example, making bequests to museums, because as you know, museums are kind of the ultimate guarantor of value. Another practice would be joining learned societies such as the Société Franco-Japonaise, attending auctions, and also lending to exhibits. And as you point out very well, women also participated in all these activities, but narratives such as Keklen's souvenir and even the Ver's private diary also are part of this narrative that makes the case for this being an exclusively masculine domain. So it's very interesting and instructive to read that in that respect. You've also encouraged me to go back to the Ver's diary and look at these women who, as you rightly point out, are lurking literally in the margins of the books, of the photographs, of the narratives. And in Rever's case, this includes Marie-Blanche and Marcel Gillot, the wife and daughter of the fine printer and Japonisant Charles Gillot, and also Florine Longueville, this great marchande who you write about extensively. So I thank you for making me look at my own work in a new way. And frankly, I think that after reading your book, no scholar will ever really look at the history of Japonisme in the same way. So I thank you. I thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about your sources. You talked a bit about them. As we saw in your images, you use a tremendous range of sources and you deploy them very creatively. And these include auction catalogs, exhibit catalogs, purchase receipts, ledgers, these wonderful ledgers of Clémence Stenry, the press, iconography, material culture, wills, marriage contracts. So you do this incredible work of archaeology to tell a story very compellingly. But of course, our story is really just the story of our sources. So I'd like to know a bit more about, the persistent memory gaps. Were there gaps that you were not able to fill with the sources, even as you very expertly read across sources to corroborate points of your story? And I do want to commend you for being quite transparent in your book about the limits of your sources. You don't pretend that they can tell the whole story. You're very good about noting the limits of them. So what were some, questions you couldn't answer?
Yeah, thank you so much, Willa. First of all, that's just incredibly thoughtful and kind and generous of you to say these things. So I will just be flustered and answer only the question, which is everything. I mean, there's so much that we don't know. The gaps are legion. I mean, I've tried to plug just a few of the gaps, and one of the ways I was able to do that is the Muse Guillemets has an incredible treasure trove of documents, because Guillemets was working in Lyon, but they've maintained all of his received and sent correspondence in the museum. So in reading through those, you find traces of all kinds of people. So it allows us to flesh out names we know from the Botin, from the telephone directory, commercial registry, with having somebody's penmanship or misspelling or illiteracy. And so I have many, many women who I just can't find, because I have, Madame Atti as someone who had a collection, and she sold a lot of things, but I can't find her civil record because it's hidden underneath that married name. I think François Proulx once said that the Proustians call it the MRS problem, and I've loved that, because that's the big gap, right? Is finding can find the references, but how do you then track down that person?
Absolutely. And as you know, there were a lot of collector couples, right? Like the Havemeyers and others. And sometimes it seemed to be difficult to know who was actually doing the act of collecting. So yeah, but you deploy an incredibly rich number of sources to great effect. Let's pick up on a couple of issues that you evoked in your introduction. Why don't we start with the legal juridical context? This is a period when, to a certain extent, the status of women is improving. Women can open up their own bank accounts. In 1906, they can control their own salaries. Of course, the Loi Naquet in 1884 authorizing divorce. So women are acquiring a certain amount of financial clout. And it seems to me that that's one of the motors of this economy. There are women such as Madame d'Enry who have succeeded in amassing independent wealth that allows them to build these collections. I went back to Weber's marriage contract and realized that his wife brought 300,000 francs to the marriage, which I believe is the equivalent of $3 million today in that vicinity. So what can you say about kind of women's financial clout as a motor of the kind of economic activity you were talking about in terms of collecting Japonisme?
Yeah, I think this is a huge and really interesting question. So, I mean, the question of money and collecting is a big one in general, and I see that Virginie Duzet has asked a similar question in the chat that talks about men without money. And I do see that one of the reasons that Japonisme becomes attractive is it's creating a new category of art for people who can't afford old master paintings, for example. And so you can buy a Japanese print for nothing. Somebody like Zachary Astruc, that Virginie mentions, is particularly that kind of a case. Is men who don't have those means can go out and create this new a new category where they can be collectors and have distinction. For women, so the economy of women, I think you're right that the dowries are massive. We don't talk so much about how those dowries are spent and what women thought about if their husbands went out and purchased all these collections. Madame d'Enry is interesting because she was separated, and so she had huge amounts of money. She invested in trains, right, in the stock market, in real estate. She had properties all over, and so she was a rentière. When she married Adolphe d'Enry, at the beginning she had more money than he did. She supported him in his early career. It was quite interesting to see how the money game plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. You really have to wonder how many women were supporting their husbands' collecting habits too. I mean, with Weber, this is very clear. You just mentioned this sort of depletion of certain markets and then emergence of new ones. So you mentioned that collectors who could no longer afford old master paintings, or even for that matter, the Impressionists, when, for example, the prices of Monet start to skyrocket in the 1890s and go on to more affordable categories of Japanese art. And then I would argue on to Islamic art for some of these collectors. I'm wondering if you see women in these kind of related fields of, I would like to ask you a series of questions about that, but do you think, is there a specificity to the market for Japonisme, or would you think this is a generalizable paradigm that you'd see women kind of lurking on the sidelines in terms of Islamic art collecting or, modern painting collecting?
Yes. I think, from the examples I can think of, I think it's a generalizable paradigm that has to do with resources. And I see that Jan Matlock asked a question in the chat about dowries and who could spend it. And that's exactly right. If there's the section that's put away. But anyway, but I think that ends up being in a different category of issues. But for for Islamic art in particular, I mean, we can think of the work being done right now by several of our members, so Rachel Mesch and Heidi Braddock-Zender, who are working on Jane Junafoi, right, and the archaeological digs, where she is part of that, and she gets credit because of the particular relationship between Jane and her husband. And I think in the end, a lot of it, so it's generalizable in terms of a phenomenon that women are participating, but it's not generalizable in terms of the individual relationships. Each family is different, each marriage contract may or may not be different, the conditions of each dowry may be different. And so how do you, so we can talk about the phenomenon of participation as, I think, quite general. And it's how there's any recognition for that participation. Who recognizes the wife who copies out all of the manuscripts and provides editorial feedback, or writes a short story? Yeah,
the particular cases can be idiosyncratic, but you've made me think a lot about the relationship of Japonisme to fields such as the decorative arts, to fields such as Impressionist painting collection. You think about Georges Petit, one of the great Impressionist dealers, having an exhibit of Japanese art in his gallery. Also Art Nouveau with people like Bever and Gillot and Grasset, belonging to both milieux. So I've tried to, think about where women fit in these kind of overlapping milieux, and the milieu of bibliophilia that I've studied too. You mentioned Juliette Adon being a bibliophile, but the bibliophile milieu seems much more impervious to women somehow. It's a very resolutely misogynistic and homosocial milieu with Octave Uzan at the center. But I mean, these are, the field of Japonisme is not an isolated field, right? It's related to closely allied fields of the decorative arts, of Impressionist painting, of other forms of collecting as well. So I don't know. I don't know if I have a comment on that, but just I wonder how women fit into that discourse. And, if you could maybe even relate the field of Japonisme to that of decorative arts during this period, because as we discussed the other day, in the discourse of Japonisme, women are denigrated as decorative, yet this is the period when the decorative arts are being legitimated as art. So somewhat of a paradox.
That's right.
There's a lot of questions.
I was like, which one do I tackle first?
Maybe the last one about women being simultaneously denigrated as decorative and frivolous at the same time as a new artistic field is emerging as legitimate, that of the decorative arts, with the founding of the Union Centrale.
Yeah. Well, I may actually be able to weave answers to both parts at the same time. And I think through lending and participation in exhibits. So for example, the exhibits at the Galerie Georges Petit were Sarah Bernard and Louise Caron d'Anvers and others loaned their objects and were recognized for those loans. Whereas and at the Union Centrale, and that's actually another, is talking about sources, that's another great place because they've got all of the historical materials related to those exhibits that took place, those first exhibits. And so it's really easy to see who they approached, who said no, who said yes, the people who subscribed to the catalog. So you have a real sense of this relationship and the kind of networking that's going on in these different milieux. For the decorative arts in particular, so it's men doing the organizing of the most of the exhibits, except if it's exhibits of women's art, sort of the Exposition des Femmes. And yet they have women who are going up. You mentioned Florine Rouvel, and she goes out and does all kinds of tasks for Coquelin, who's trying to get collectors to loan their objects. So that's talking more about the participation, the sort of unsung participation. I think in terms of the larger issue of the decorative arts, I think it gets rebranded. I mean, for lack of a better word, is that as the decorative arts, it becomes decorative arts to get away from people's decorating their homes. I mean, the mass market, if it's pushed into something like Art Nouveau, it's a new way to brand something as extremely refined and distinct rather than mass market production.
I agree with you. And the ultimate kind of imprimatur would be the state imprimatur, of the state sponsoring the exhibit of Art Décoratif at the 1900 Exposition Universelle. So that's sort of the ultimate legitimating factor. So much to talk about. You mentioned Louise Kahn-D'Anvers. You note in your book too, there are quite a lot of Jews in this milieu of Japonisme. Florine Langveld, Louise Kahn-D'Anvers, Sarah Bernhardt, although she converted to Catholicism, Madame d'Emery by marriage, and the Camondo and the Crucy, of course, of different social classes. It's not coherent socially, but what do you make about that? You talked a bit about anti-Semitism in this milieu and also the kind of legitimation that collecting practices provided for Jews during this period.
I mean, I think that last little bit of your question answers it to a large extent. It's this wonderful social ladder, collecting, distinction, being excuse me, mirroring the Ancien Régime, right? Sort of having this aristocratic opulence and appreciation of art is cultural distinction. There's some really fantastic work coming out. So I touch on it a little bit with these figures, which Japonisme then is part of it. But there's a fantastic thesis by Alice Léger on the Caron d'Anvers family, and there's some really nice work being done by Tom Stammers and Sylvia Davioli in the UK on Jewish country homes and collections. There's a fantastic new volume on the Rothschilds as collectors in France. So some really, really good work on specifically this issue of cultural distinction and dynasties and
Very interesting. I mean, it's just in terms of the history of Jews in France, it's very interesting too to see this period, that will end with the Dreyfus affair, and a lot of anti-Semitism being directed for these collectors, but it's not so true of the earlier period that you discussed. But, do we have time for one more comment, Masha?
I think so, and we have quite a few questions.
I know, I see. Well, of course. Maybe I'll just end with an observation, which might be a question too. You mentioned Bourdieu, Elizabeth, and theories of cultural production. I think that your book is very instructive, would be a good primer in testing the limits of Bourdieu's theory. I think you show very well that Bourdieu's notion of a field of restricted production divorced from the field of mass production. That is this small group, this closed community in which producers are also consumers and producers are producing for other consumers. It's even though it's restricted, it's very close to the mass market. These elite connoisseurs are very concerned with value, with bargain hunting, with getting the best bang for their buck. So I think that you kind of put a footnote on this idea of restricted production. How restricted really was it? And the other point I would make is simply that for Bourdieu, the boundaries of the field are always en jeu. So I think you show very well how this increasingly narrow forging of definitions of what is art and what is Japanese art of value is part of what is en jeu during this period. It's not the objects themselves, but also the value attached to them.
Yeah, thank you. That's beautifully put. And I do think that they are in flux, and it's a question of strategy and position. Yeah.
So, and power and
power.
Petition. Yeah. Thank you again.
You. Fantastic questions. Wow.
So Willa, would you like me to jump in with the questions?
Sure. I saw there were a lot of questions accumulating.
So the first question is from Juliette Bello, and she's wondering about what you can say about the racial dynamics embedded within these collecting practices. How much you think that this group of mostly, if not wholly European female collectors were mobilizing Orientalism in order to secure their own white privilege?
Yes, I think that you have said it, Juliette. So there's a sense of, part of it is at first, collecting, this story of collecting is often one of taste and of starting to just buy things that interest one, and it's only afterwards that it's narratively constructed as a collection. And so those are, really good points that come from Baudrillard and Yekebal. And so you have to ask about the intentionality, and then what ends up after the fact being what we see in, for example, the Muse Identity, which is a kind of a fantasy of the Far East, right, where she's put these all together. But she didn't, and so, yes, that is what ends up happening. And how do you get there? And I think that your point is an excellent one. That is exactly what they're doing, is they are taking advantage of another culture's exports. Although in the case of Japan, it's interesting because some of the first wave was nobles selling their antique wares, and in the second wave, it is actually artisans mass producing things for the French market, and they're actually exploiting the French women to make money. So it's a very superficial answer to a really good question.
All right. So there is also a question about the relationship in gender and money. Do you think that it's from Virginie Duzet? Do you think that the question of gender was the central point that discriminated individuals? Was it really that put women in the margins, or did money matter too? For instance, she's thinking about Zachary Astruc, who was also marginalized in the group of Japonistes because he was lacking the means to be collecting as much as Goncourt. So were there rich collector women who had no agency and no visibility at all in the group? Could you give the example of one?
Right. So yes. So I tried to answer the Zachary Astruc a teeny bit in terms of shifting topics. I think that it's not gender that is. I try to argue in the book that it has to do with visibility and positioning. There are plenty of people there are plenty of men who are marginalized as collectors because they don't play the game. And so to give you an example, actually from the Goncourt. After the 1883 exhibit of Japanese art at the Galerie Georges Petit, Goncourt savages Philippe Burti. He said he's a salesman, he's hawking his wares, he's sitting there day in and day out talking to people and making contacts and making money. He's like, but it's a new world we live in, and we got to play the game if we want to be remembered. And then he does that in his preface to La Fille Elisa, where he stakes a claim in the newspapers for having been the first Japoniste. And he's like, I'm really embarrassed to have done it, but you got to do it. So I think it's the people who want to play so if you have the money, you can play the game. And even if you don't have the money, you can play the game. But women then go into a different category. Women and Japanese nationals who are also marginalized. It's not just women. So I hope I answered that.
Yeah. So then we have a question from Mike Garval, who's wondering if your research took you into the Dîner de la Société des Amis de l'Art Japonais, and if so, what you might have learned from or about these events. Such dinners of literary and artistic societies were often largely old boy men's club sort of gatherings, so he's wondering what role women may have played in them.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's a great question. It actually pulls back to Willa's one of Willa's questions. So in the book, I do talk about that. What I think is interesting is you see the divide between the most prevalent form of dîner japonisant, which is in somebody's living room with their kids and their wives around, and they're just talking about art. And so the Société des Dîners, les dîners japonisants, go into a restaurant where they can be by themselves. So it is very much an old boy network. But what is absolutely fascinating about them is they're not predominantly Japanese at all, despite all of the beautiful artwork that advertises them. And I know this from Willa's book, in fact, because Wever describes these in huge detail. If anybody's interested in these dinners, he will say on April X date, so-and-so brought this, so-and-so brought this. And so he actually explains in great detail all of the different objects, many of which were Islamic, many of which were medieval. They were not, I was so shocked to learn that they were not, in fact, all Japanese objects. So, for what it's worth.
If I can just add very quickly, they often play into these origin stories that you talk about, because members will come with an old scroll and claim that it is the oldest, or that it is the first. So it's a kind of locus of the mythologizing, I think, about Japonisme. And they resemble very much the dîner des bibliophiles also, in this sort of male clubland, very homosocial milieu in which feminized objects are passed around for delectation.
Mm-hmm. And Chris Reed's book on Bachelor Japanists is really good. And I should say, if you haven't read it, it's not all about men. There are women, lots of women. It's a really important book. And that the idea that, but he treats that really well, this idea of the jockeying and the one-upsmanship and the need to be the first.
It's really fascinating. So Jen Matlock brings us back to the question of money. And I think you've touched upon this already a little bit, about the question about dowry. And could you say again how much, so actually it's a question for both Willa and Elizabeth, how much Wever's wife brought to the marriage? And roughly, do we know how much it's worth today? And could the husbands actually use the dowries, or didn't women get to keep some of the money?
Well, if I may, I mean, it depended in part on the régime matrimonial under which they were married. So Wever was married under the Communauté des Biens. So what his wife Jeanne, who's this silent woman in his diaries, who he just speaks about very derisively as a Leisberg, because they were married under this regime. Their property and money was in common, so that money became his. I think, Elizabeth, you mentioned a case of séparation des biens, don't you? In one of the couples, maybe the Dennery, I don't recall.
Yeah, the Dennery case is really interesting. So she was married very young to, interestingly, the son of the deputy mayor of the 11th arrondissement. So she was from a very good family, but clearly it was an arranged marriage, and he went off to Algeria 3 years later, which left her with this tremendous independence. When she remarried Dennery in 1881, after the death of the first husband, I think it's actually my theory is it's the trigger for protecting the museum. She had kind of not realized that doing that communauté des biens was going to mean that he controlled her creation. So she added a clause to the marriage contract saying that she could keep all of the decorative objects in the house and all of the mobilier. So she was cognizant of it, and it's very shortly afterwards that she starts protecting it as a collection and trying to gift the most important pieces to the Louvre and to the Musée Guimet.
All right, so we have a question from Sharon Johnson about Mary Cassatt. We know that Mary Cassatt was heavily inspired by an exhibition of Japanese graphic arts that she has seen in 1890 at the École des Beaux-Arts, in particular the colored wood block prints by Kitawaga Utamaro. Did she contribute intellectually to its definition through writing? Do you?
So actually, that's a good question. I don't know how much she wrote. And there are a lot of people on here who can participate in the chat and give that answer. What what I think is interesting, what I can answer about the question, is the fact that how much of what we consider important is what is written, right? And it plays into this connoisseurship model that women can't be collectors if they're not writing. And so I get questions a lot about, well, what was Denali reading and what did she write about Japanese art? And it's the writing about that makes you a specialist. And so just to say that's what we do, and that's how we've constructed knowledge. And so if you are creating, I see Juliet Bello is chiming in, thank you. Yeah, right, making an artwork is a form of thinking, right? It is an intellectual commitment. It's an expression. So Clémence Dennery didn't write scientifically about her collection, but she kept these ledgers of what she bought and what she thought of them, and she embroidered all of these tapestries that were apparently influenced by the artworks, by the objects she collected, but we don't know what happened to them. And so I can't answer the specific question, but I can answer the larger question of, should we only value writing? And especially for people, doesn't that then exclude all of those who participated and might have written if they had the education to do so? And so how we frame the people we consider as important, and so. Nikki, I see there's a Nikki Drogopoulos. Yes, they did write about going. Berthe Moiseau and Marikessa did go to the exhibit together, and that was the first quite clubby exhibit where it was mostly men exhibiting, and they were no longer asking women to contribute. There's a fantastic article about that exhibit in the Journal du Japonese, with all kinds of recreating how that exhibit came along.
Really fascinating. All right, I think we have only one more question from Jennifer Forrest. Was there a way for these collecting women to use subversively the reduction of themselves in their activities to the decorative?
Was there a way for these collecting to use subversively? Oh, I don't know what that means. Jennifer, can you clarify?
You want me to say this out loud, or do you want me to send it?
Yeah, just explain what you mean by subversively and how they're being reduced.
Just to, you were, both you and Willa were talking about the reduction of women and to their activities as collectors to being sort of like decorative, and the objects were decorative.
Oh, right.
Is there a way that they somehow use it in order to gain a certain amount of power? Use that sort of dismissal of their actions to the decorative so that it actually empowers them somehow?
Yes, I love your question. Now that I understand. I will give you the example of Clémence Dennery. And this is the part that people know about her because the Goncourt were absolutely fascinated by her, and Edmond was repulsed, which is why she disappears from the journal. So as a young woman, right, she's being taken as a decorative. So that the first scene where Jules Goncourt goes home with her in a carriage at 5 in the morning, and she says, "Come on up and see my monsters," right? And he thinks that she's just seducing him. And so she actually wants him to come and admire her curation in 1859. And so he comes and he's like, "All right, let's have a nice time." And she's like, "No, wait. And she does a big reveal. She opens it. So she plays on this sense that she's just going to be decorative and easy to actually show him up. And he is absolutely gobsmacked. He's like, "This is the most amazing salon I have ever seen." And her collection goes on to inspire all of the Goncourt's early writing on Japanese monsters, which they, of course, erase. So maybe that's a good example.
Another example I thought of from your book that's coming to mind has to do with shunga, the erotic Japanese prints. So, which some female collectors, René Vivien, I guess, consulted and looked at. And it just seems to me that that's another example where women are breaking, the model of the idea as being exoticized and eroticized, and taking hold themselves of this kind of erotic material and viewing it on their own terms.
Absolutely.
Slightly subversive to me.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question. And feel free to unmute yourself and just ask it or put it in the chat.
I'll actually just jump on that to say that Melanie's working on, I think her book is coming out maybe next year, on René Vivien. And so and Japanese, so I'll be really eager to read that.
Well, this brings us to 3 o'clock. And so I would like to thank both Willa and Elizabeth for a really magnificent and fascinating conversation. I'm really looking forward to reading the book.